Well, you guys, here we are. The grand finale to this legendary trilogy that was originally released on the Super Nintendo. We've talked about Donkey Kong Country and how it began this timeless franchise. We talked about Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest, and how it continued and expanded upon the first game's excellence. And now, we find ourselves here, at the end of our journey through Donkey Kong Island. All that's left now is to dive into one of the most divisive games that Nintendo themselves ever published. Is this the epic culmination that people wanted? Or was it the anticlimax of the Super Nintendo? Let's discuss. Nintendo, and more specifically Rare, was in a really tough spot when it came to developing and releasing Donkey Kong Country 3. Not only were they just coming off of one of the most critically acclaimed games ever made in Donkey Kong Country 2, but by this point it almost felt like not really anybody cared, as sad as that sounds. Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble was released in November of 1996, a few months after the Nintendo 64 was released in September of the same year. So not only did they have to try to recreate the success and the acclaim that Donkey Kong Country 2 garnered, but they had to do so on outdated hardware, on hardware that people had already seemed to forget about. And upon writing my script and doing my research for this video, people have a lot of strong opinions on this game, more so than I ever could have imagined. With the first game, it's the first game, everybody loves it. With the second game, it's the second game, the quote-unquote superior sequel. Everyone loves it, but with this game, it is a completely different story. You either love it, you hate it, it's insane, and I can't wait to dive into it. Before I get into the reasons, I just wanted to preface this by saying I do not love this game, I do not hate this game. This is definitely going to be a positive video essay, a positive retrospective. I do like the game, I do enjoy it, however, it does have many glaring flaws, and it is by far my least favorite in the original trilogy, so let's get into it. Starting off with some of the positives, the things that I liked about the game. The game still has incredibly engaging gameplay mechanics, much like the first two games. Donkey Kong Country 3 introduces several new gameplay mechanics that add depth and variety to the experience as you progress. The game retained the core platforming, thankfully, and the elements that made the predecessor successful while introducing new features such as Kiddy Kong's water skip, among other things. Speaking of Kiddy Kong, let's get this elephant out of the room. I do not like Kiddy Kong. I don't hate him. I'm not in the corners of the internet that wish ill upon him, that are just dedicated to hating Kiddy Kong. I don't hate him, but I definitely don't like him. He is by far my least favorite playable character in this original trilogy of games, and I wish they would have just introduced Donkey Kong back into the game. Like I said before, it's called Donkey Kong Country, and he's only playable in one of the three games. Kiddy Kong controls very similarly to Donkey Kong in the strength and the speed aspect, so why not just get rid of Kiddy Kong and bring DK back? Come on. One thing that I cannot fault this game on is the intricate level design. I really enjoy most of the levels in this game. The level design in Donkey Kong Country 3 is often praised, rightfully so, for its creativity and challenge, much like the first two original games. Each level is meticulously crafted to provide a unique experience with obstacles and puzzles and enemies that require players to fully utilize both characters' abilities. Many levels offer alternate paths and secret areas, again, much like the first two games, encouraging exploration and replayability. These hidden areas often contain bonus games and collectible items such as coins, making each playthrough potentially different than the last. The game also boasts a wide variety of environments, from dense forests and snowy mountains to underwater caverns and industrial zones. Again, much like the first two games. Each environment, however, introduces new challenges and enemies, keeping the gameplay fresh and engaging. The soundtrack in Donkey Kong Country 3 is definitely the weakest out of the original trilogy in my opinion, but it still isn't bad. The soundtrack of Donkey Kong Country 3 was composed by Evelyn Fisher this time around, who helped David Wise a bit in the first two games, but David Wise did not return for the third game. Evelyn Fisher contributes significantly to the game's appeal with the soundtrack. The music is very atmospheric and perfectly complements the various environments and themes throughout the game. Despite the Super Nintendo being outdated by this point, they once again went the route of using the pre-rendered 3D models for the characters, and it did not disappoint. Donkey Kong Country 3 still looks great. and boasts impressive graphics and art style. Kind of going off of the graphics and art style here, the game's story and setting contribute a lot to this game's appeal. DKC 3 takes place in the northern Cremisphere, which is, in my opinion, the coolest area that we've ever had to explore. It's a new region in the Donkey Kong universe. The hub world also is so insanely cool. I love that you can go around and you can upgrade the hoverboat thing. Like, that was never a thing in the original 2 games, so having it here I thought was really nice. The game also does quite a bit more world building by introducing various NPCs such as the Brothers Bear, who offer side quests and additional narrative elements. Interacting with these characters adds depth to the game's world, makes it feel more real, and provides a break from the main platforming action. And hate me if you will, but this game features my favorite boss battles in the entire trilogy. Boss battles in Donkey Kong Country 3 are far more memorable for their design and difficulty than the other 2 games, at least again in my opinion. Each boss requires a different strategy to defeat, often involving the use of specific character abilities or environmental features. These battles are a test of players' skills, and they add a satisfying sense of accomplishment upon victory. Every single boss fight is distinct, and it requires players to adapt their strategies and learn new patterns. This variety kept me thoroughly engaged throughout my entire playthrough. And as we wrap up this section, I think it's important for me to say that this game did get very positive reviews. It wasn't until much later that people started to gain a little bit of hatred for it. And embracing that hatred, let's get into the things that did not work for me and most people. DKC 3 faced a mix of criticism and disappointment from players for several reasons. One of the major points of contention, not only for myself but others, was the sheer absence of the iconic duo. Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong were nowhere to be found. Their replacement with Dixie Kong and newly introduced Kiddy Kong felt like a departure from the beloved dynamic that many fans like myself cherished. Kiddy Kong in particular received mixed reactions, more so today, with some players finding him less appealing and less charismatic compared to Donkey and Diddy, which is not an opinion, it's a fact. I love Dixie Kong. She's up there with Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong as the core 3, but Kiddy Kong just is not it. He is not him. The game's difficulty balance also drew in a fair amount of criticism. While some players appreciated the challenge, others found it frustrating due to inconsistent difficulty spikes and overly complex collectible requirements throughout the game. Achieving 100% completion required finding numerous hidden items, which could be tedious and excessively challenging for some. The increased focus on water-based levels, which is a giant flaw in my opinion, and new mechanics like Elliot the Elephant's water-sucking ability received mixed feedback, with some players finding these mechanics less intuitive and enjoyable than their traditional platforming that this franchise is known for. And like I said earlier, the graphics and music were praised, but some players felt that they didn't quite live up to the standards set by its predecessors. The visual design, while still very impressive for the hardware that it was running on, it had a slightly different aesthetic that didn't really resonate with all players, and it didn't really resonate with me either. Similarly, like I said in the beginning, the soundtrack, despite being composed by Evelyn Fisher, it lacked the iconic atmospheric quality of the previous game's music. I really enjoy the musical score for this game, but it just doesn't come close to reaching the heights that the first 2 reached. The storyline in Donkey Kong Country 3 was seen by some as less engaging compared to its predecessors. These games have never been known for their riveting story, but this one is the worst. The absence of King K. Rool as the main antagonist in a prominent role initially, with his appearance later as Baron K. Rulenstein, it definitely lessened the narrative impact, at least for me. He has almost no presence, no aura. The introduction of Chaos as the new primary villain initially confused a lot of players and felt less impactful. Additionally, the game's release towards the end of the SNES's life cycle played a role in mixed receptions. By '96, the gaming community was beginning to shift its attention to next-generation consoles like the N64, like I said before. It overshadowed the game's release, and it was doomed from the start. The quick succession of the 3 Donkey Kong Country games on the same platform also could have led to some fatigue, with players feeling that this third installment didn't innovate enough to justify another purchase so soon after the second game had been released. A lot of people argue that this game isn't even mid or isn't even bad. It's just overshadowed by the perfection that is Donkey Kong Country 2, and I think there is some merit to that. Comparisons with Donkey Kong Country 2: Diddy's Kong Quest, often regarded as the pinnacle of the series and arguably the pinnacle of the Super Nintendo, worked to the detriment of Donkey Kong Country 3. High expectations set by the success of the previous game meant any perceived shortcomings in the third installment were magnified. As a sequel, it faced the challenge of living up to its predecessor's legacy, which was virtually impossible. And some players felt it didn't quite capture the same magic and innovation, making it feel like a step down in several regards. Adding on to this, the game's design often required players to backtrack and revisit previous areas to find hidden collectibles or complete certain tasks that you might have missed. At face value, that's a very normal thing to have to do in a platformer. But with the first two games, the flow of the game was never disrupted by this because these objectives were very streamlined and happened as you completed the levels. However, in this game, it disrupted the flow and felt like padding rather than meaningful content. The mini-games, while offering variety for sure, a lot of the times they felt out of place and not nearly as engaging as the main platforming levels in the game. The shift in focus from pure platforming to a mix of different gameplay styles was not universally appreciated, not by me and not by most players. With all that being said, Donkey Kong Country 3: Dixie Kong's Double Trouble faced a vast amount of criticism for deviating from established characters, inconsistent difficulty spikes, mixed reception of new mechanics, changes in visual and musical direction, a less impactful storyline, platform fatigue, and astronomically high expectations set by its predecessor. But at the same time, the game is still a lot of fun, at least it is to me. It's beloved by a lot of people. It's still got great level design, really fun gameplay, some pretty solid music if I'm being honest. It's just disappointing. It's not a bad game. It is not a bad game at all. It was just disappointing coming off of the perfection of the first two games, which is completely understandable. And it introduced us to Kiddy Kong, so immediate points docked for that. Is this my least favorite of the Donkey Kong Country trilogy? Yes, it is. In my opinion, it is the weakest. However, it is still a perfectly adequate finale to this trilogy of games. And that does it for my series of video essays on the Donkey Kong Country trilogy. You guys have to let me know in the comments, what do you think of this game? I know it is by far the most divisive out of the three and probably out of the whole Donkey Kong Country franchise. So let me know what you think of the trilogy as a whole. Thank you guys for sharing this journey with me. The channel is still growing at a very fast pace, and I'm so excited for what the future holds. Thank you guys so much for everything. Have a great day. I'll see you in the next video. Take care.